What does it mean to be so deeply enmeshed with our world and one another's lives that we share the pure space where imagination lives and reality is born? If we're more than simply casual onlookers, watching as our lives and the world happen around us, then just how much more? Well, the previous discoveries demonstrate that there is a power within each of us. It's unlike any power ever created by a machine in the laboratory. It's a power that is unbound by the laws of physics, at least not the physics that we understand today. But we don't need a laboratory experiment to know that this connection exists. How many times, for example, have you gone to call someone on the phone, someone that you care about, and when you pick up the phone and you dial, you discover that they're already on the line? Or when you dialed that number, you discovered the line was busy because your friend was already calling you? Or how many times have you found yourself enjoying time with friends or in a busy street or a mall or an airport, only to have that eerie feeling that you've already been in that place or with those people before, doing exactly what you're doing in that moment? While these are simple examples and they're fun to talk about, they're more than just random coincidences. Although we may not be able to prove scientifically why these things happen, we all know that they do. And in such moments of connectedness and déjà vu, we find ourselves spontaneously transcending the limits of science as we know them today, our physical laws. In those brief instances, we're reminded there's probably more to the universe and certainly more to us than we consciously acknowledge. And that's the same power that tells us that we're more than just observers in this world. The key to experiencing ourselves as more than observers is to create those experiences on purpose, to create them intentionally, to have our transcendent insights when we choose to have them rather than when they just seem to happen. It all comes down to what we believe about ourselves and our role in the universe. And that is what the next section is all about. We are creators. And even more than that, we're connected creators. Through the divine matrix, we participate in the constant change that gives meaning to life. The question now is less about whether or not we're passive observers and more about how we can intentionally create in our world. Chapter 3. Are we passive observers or powerful creators? Speaking quantum. In 1854, Chief Seattle warned American legislators how the destruction of North America's wilderness had implications that would reach far beyond their time and even threaten the survival of future generations. Through profound wisdom that's as true today as it was then, the chief simply stated that man did not weave the web of life. He is merely a strand in it. Whatever he does to the web, he does to himself. The parallel between Chief Seattle's description of our place in the web of life and our connection with and within the divine matrix is unmistakable. As part of all that we see, we are participants in this ongoing conversation, a quantum dialogue with ourselves, our world, and even beyond. Within this cosmic conversation, our feelings, emotions, our prayers, and beliefs in each moment of every day represent us speaking to the universe, and every day, from the vitality of our bodies to the peace of our world, the universe is speaking back. As mentioned earlier, physicist John Wheeler suggests that we play not only a role, but we also play the prime role in what he calls a participatory universe. The key to Wheeler's statement is the word participatory. In a participatory universe, you and I are part of the equation. We're both catalysts for the events in our lives as well as the experiencers of what we create. Both are happening precisely the same time. Wheeler says that we're part of a universe. It's a work in progress. In this unfinished creation, he says that we're tiny patches of the universe looking at itself and building itself. So Wheeler's statement opens the door to a radical possibility. And that possibility is simply this. If consciousness creates, then the universe itself may be the result of consciousness. While Wheeler's views were proposed late in the 20th century, we can't help but think back to Max Planck's statement that matter exists because of what he called an intelligent mind, the matrix of all matter. So now the question that begs to be asked here is simply this: what mind? In a participatory universe, the act of focusing our consciousness, of us looking somewhere and examining our world, is an act of creation in and of itself. We are the ones looking. We're the ones who are examining our world. We are the mind, or at least part of a greater mind, this Planck described. Everywhere we look, our consciousness makes something for us to look at, and this is our fifth key in the understanding of the divine matrix. Key number 5 simply states that the act of focusing awareness is an act of creation. Consciousness creates. From our search to find the smallest particle of matter to our quest to define the edge of the universe, this relationship suggests that we may never find either. Because no matter how deeply we peer into the quantum world of the atom, or how far we reach into the vastness of outer space, it's the act of us looking, with the exception that something exists, that may be precisely the act that creates something for us to see. A participatory universe. Exactly what does that mean? If consciousness really creates, then how much power do we really have to change our world? Well, the answer might surprise you. The 20th century visionary from Barbados, simply known by the name Neville, perhaps best described our ability to make our dreams a reality and bring imagination to life. In terms that are simple yet direct. Through his books and lectures, he shared the following great secret of how to navigate the many possibilities of our divine matrix. Because from Neville's perspective, all that we experience, literally everything that happens to us or is done by us, is the product of consciousness and absolutely nothing else. He believed that our ability to bring this understanding through the power of imagination is all that stands between us and the miracles of our lives. Just as the divine matrix provides the container for the entire universe, Neville suggested that it's impossible for anything to happen outside of this container. How easy it is to think otherwise. Immediately after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, for example, in New York and Washington, D.C., the question everyone was asking was why? Why did they do this to us? What did we do to them? Well, we live in a time in history when it's so easy to think of the world in terms of them and us, and to ask how bad things can happen to good people. If there is, in fact, a single field of energy that connects everything in our world, and if the divine matrix works the way the evidence suggests, then there can be no them and us. There's only a we, and we are all that is. From the leaders of countries that we've learned to fear and hate to the people of countries that touch our hearts and invite our love, we're all connected in what may be the most intimate way imaginable. We're connected in the field of consciousness that's the incubator for nothing less than our reality. Together, we create the healing or the suffering. Together, we create the war or the peace. This may just be the most difficult implication of what the new science is showing us. It may also be the source of our greatest healing and even our survival. Neville's work reminds us that perhaps the greatest error in our worldview is to look to external reasons for life's ups and downs. While there are certainly causes and effects that may lead to the events of every day, they seem to originate from a time and a place that appears completely disconnected with the moment. In a single sentence, Neville shares the crux of the greatest mystery regarding our relationship to the world around us. Man's chief delusion, he says, is his conviction that there are causes other than his own state of consciousness. So just what does this mean? This is the practical question that naturally arises when we talk about living in a participatory universe. When we ask the question of how much power we really have to bring about change in our lives, the answer is simple, and it's summarized as the next key number 6 in understanding the divine matrix. And the key simply states that we have all the power we need to create all of the change that we choose. And it's available to us through the way we use the power of our awareness and where we choose to place our focus. In his book entitled The Power of Awareness, Neville offers example after example of case histories that very clearly illustrate precisely how this power works. And one of the most poignant has remained with me for years. It's the story of a man in his 20s who'd been diagnosed with a rare heart condition his doctors believed would be fatal. He was married, he had 2 small children, he had every reason in the world to live. Those who knew him and loved him also knew that he had every reason in the world to live a long and healthy life. And by the time Neville was asked to speak with this man, He'd lost a tremendous amount of weight, and he had shrunk to what Neville called almost a skeleton. The man was so weak that even conversation was hard for him. He agreed to simply listen to Neville and nod his head in understanding as Neville shared with him the power of his beliefs. From the perspective of us participating in a dynamic and evolving universe, there can be only one solution to any problem. That solution is a change in attitude and a change in consciousness. Well, with this idea in mind, Neville asked the man to experience himself as if his healing had already taken place. As the poet William Blake suggests, there's a very fine line between imagination and reality. Man is all imagination, Blake reminds us, and just as physicist David Bohm suggests that this world is a projection of events in a deeper realm of reality, Blake continues, stating that all you behold, though it appears without, it is within, in your imagination, of which this world of mortality is but a shadow. Well, through the power of consciously focusing upon the things that we create in our imagination, we give them the nudge, the quantum nudge, that brings them through the barrier between the unreal and the real. So with these ideas in mind, in a single sentence, Neville offered the words that would help the young man accomplish this new way of thinking. Neville began by simply stating that he suggested in the man's imagination that he see the doctor's face expressing incredulous amazement in finding him already recovered, contrary to all reason, from the last stages of an incurable disease. Neville went on to suggest that when the doctor came in, that the man see him double-checking his examination and hear him saying over and over, "It's a miracle, it's a miracle." Well, you can imagine the reason I'm sharing this story the way I am. The man did recover. Months later, Neville received a letter that he had, in fact, made a truly miraculous recovery, and he later met with the man and his family and found him enjoying life in perfect health. The secret, the man revealed, to his recovery was that from the day of their meeting, rather than simply thinking or wishing for his health or for his healing, the man had lived from what he called the assumption of already being well and healed. And herein, we find the subtle secret of propelling our heart's desires from the state of imagination in our dreams to the reality of our everyday lives. The secret is in our ability to feel as if our dreams have already come to life, to feel as if our desires are already fulfilled and our prayers are already answered. In this way, we actively share in what Wheeler called our participatory universe. Living from the answer. There's a subtle yet powerful difference between working toward a result and thinking and feeling from that result. Because when we work towards something, we embark upon an open-ended and never-ending journey. While we may identify milestones and set goals to get us closer to our accomplishment, in our mind, we're always on our way to the goal, rather than in the experience of accomplishing our goal. And this is precisely why Neville's admonition that we must enter the image of our desire and think from it is so powerful in our lives. In the ancient studies of martial arts, we see a beautiful metaphor in the physical world for precisely the way this principle works in consciousness. You've no doubt seen the demonstrations of people trained in the martial arts marrying their powers of concentration and strength into a single moment of really intense focus. In that focus, they're able to perform a feat, like breaking a concrete block or a stack of boards, which would otherwise be impossible for them to do. The principle that allows for such a demonstration is the same principle that Neville shared in his story of the young man's healing. And while there are tricks that can sometimes be used to do these amazing feats without the spiritual emphasis, when they are authentically performed, the key to success is where the martial artist places their attention. When they choose to break a concrete block, for example, the very last thing in the mind of a martial artist is the point of contact where their hand will touch the surface of that block. Just as Neville suggested in his instruction to the dying man, the key is to place our focus in the place of the completed act, the healing already accomplished, or in this case, the brick already broken. Martial artists do this by focusing their awareness on a point in space that is beyond the bottom of the block. And the only way that their hands can be at that place is if they've already passed through the space between them and that point. The fact that the space happens to be occupied by something solid, like a concrete block, becomes almost secondary. In this way, they're thinking from the point of completion, rather than how hard it may be to get to that point. They're feeling the joy of what it feels like to accomplish the act, rather than all the things that must happen before they can be successful in that act. This simple example offers a powerful analogy for precisely the way that consciousness seems to work. I experienced this principle personally when I was in my early 20s. It was during that time that my life turned away from the focus of working in a copper mill and playing in a rock band to the spiritual focus of an inner power. On the morning of my 21st birthday, I suddenly found myself unexpectedly drawn to the combination of long-distance running, yoga, meditation, and the martial arts. I passionately began to pursue all four together, and they became the rock that I would find myself clinging to in times when it seemed that my world was crumbling around me. Well, it was one day in the martial arts classroom in the dojo, before our karate class began, that I witnessed the power of a concentrated focus unlike anything I'd ever seen growing up in the heartland of northern Missouri. On that day, our instructor came in early. He walked into the room and asked us to do something very different from the practices that were familiar to us. He explained that he would seat himself in the center of the thick mat, the mat that we use to hone our skills every day, and he would close his eyes and he would go into a meditation. During his meditation, he would stretch his arms out on either side of his body with his palms open and face down. He asked us to give him a couple of minutes to anchor himself in this T-shaped position, and then invited us to do anything that we could to move him from his place. Well, the number of men outnumbered the women in our class by about 2-1, and there'd always been a friendly competition between the men and the women that divided the class. On that day, however, there was no competition, there was no division, because together we all sat close to our instructor, silent, motionless, as we watched. He simply walked to the center of the mat, sat down with his legs crossed, closed his eyes, held out his arms, and he changed his breath. I remember I was fascinated, and I watched closely as his chest swelled and shrank slower and slower with each breath until eventually it was hard to tell that he was even breathing at all. And with a nod of agreement, we all moved closer. One by one, we tried to move our instructor from his place on the mat. At first, we thought this was going to be an easy exercise, and only a few of us tried. As we grabbed his arms and his legs, we pushed and pulled in different directions with absolutely no success. We were amazed. We changed our strategy. We all gathered together on one side of him to use our combined weight to force him in the opposite direction, and still we could not even budge his arms or the fingers on his hands. After a few moments, took a deep breath, he opened his eyes, and with a gentle humor that we'd come to respect, he simply asked us, "What happened? How come I'm still sitting here?" After a big laugh that eased the tension, and with that familiar gleam in his eye, he explained what had just happened and what we had just seen. "When I closed my eyes," he said, "I had a vision that was like a dream, and that dream became my reality. I visualized two mountains, one on either side of my body, and myself on the ground between the two peaks." As he spoke, I immediately saw the image of his mountains in my own mind's eye, and I felt that he was somehow imbuing us with a direct experience of his vision. He went on to explain that attached to each of his arms, he saw a chain that connected him with the top of each mountain. And as long as those chains were there, he said he was connected to the mountains in a way that nothing could change. And that's what we experienced. Our instructor looked around the mat at the eyes that were riveted on each word he was sharing, and with a big grin, he concluded, "Not even a classroom of my best students could change my dream." Well, through a brief demonstration in a martial arts classroom, this beautiful man had just given each of us a direct experience of the power to redefine our relationship to our physical world. The lesson was less about reacting to what the world was showing us and more about creating our own rules for what we choose to experience. The secret here is that he was experiencing himself from the place that he was already fixed in that location, on that mat in his imagination. In those moments, he was living from the outcome of his meditation. And until he chose to break the chains in his imagination, nothing could move him, and that is precisely what happened. In Neville's words, the way you do this is to make what he called your future dream a present fact. In a non-scientific language that sounds almost too easy to be true, Neville tells us precisely how this is done. Please don't be deceived by the simplicity of Neville's words when he suggests that all we need to do to transform our imagination into reality is to assume the feeling of our wish fulfilled. In a participatory universe of our own making, why would we expect that the power to create would be any more difficult than that? Many possibilities, one reality. Why would the way that we think and feel about our world have any effect whatsoever on the events that play out in our lives? How does simply making our future dream a present fact change the course of events that are already underway? If it looks like our world is barreling down the path toward a global war, for example, does that war really have to happen? When it looks as if our marriage is about to crumble or we're destined to live with a debilitating health condition, does the outcome of these experiences really have to happen as predicted? Or is there another factor? One that's often discounted that may in fact play a powerful role in how we experience the things that are already set into motion. Does life follow our predictions, or does life meet our expectations? These are powerful questions. The key to living from the place where our imagination is already fulfilled and our dreams and prayers are already answered is to understand how the possibilities exist to begin with. And to do that, we need to return just briefly to the central discovery that quantum physics tells us about our world. As we mentioned earlier, quantum physics has been hugely successful in describing the behavior of things that are smaller than the atom. So successful, in fact, that a set of rules to describe what we can expect to happen in this tiny invisible world have been created. But while the rules are few and simple, they can also sound strange as they describe the things that particles can do at the subatomic level. And they tell us, for example, that the laws of physics are not universal because things behave differently at small scales than they do in our everyday world. They tell us that energy can express itself sometimes as a wave, sometimes as a particle, sometimes as both. They tell us that consciousness, the consciousness of the observer, determines how energy will behave. Well, as good as these rules are, however, it's important to remember that the equations of quantum physics do not describe the actual existence of particles. In other words, the laws can't tell us precisely where particles are and how they act once they get there. What they do is they describe the potential for the particle's existence. That is, where the particles may be and how they may behave and what their properties may be like. And all of these properties evolve and they change over time. These things are important for this reason, because we're made of the same particles that those rules are describing. So if we can understand how those particles work, then maybe we can understand greater possibilities for how we work as well. And it's here that we find a powerful key to understanding what quantum physics is really saying to us about our power in the universe. Our world, our lives, our bodies, they exist as they do because they were imagined from the world of quantum possibilities. If we want to change any of these things, we must first see them in a new way. To do so is to choose again from the soup of many quantum possibilities. Then, in our world, it seems that only one of those quantum possibilities can become what we experience as our reality. In his vision, for example, my karate instructor observed himself fixed to that mat in a place and time, and for those moments in time, he was. No one could move him. So which of the many possibilities becomes real appears to be determined by consciousness in the act of what scientists have now called observation. In other words, the object of our attention, where we place our focus, is what becomes the reality of our world, and in the context of our everyday world, the observer is us. So key number 7 reminds us of this principle. It simply states that the focus of your feelings becomes the reality of your world. Clearly, our role in the universe is central to the question of why the quantum world works the way it appears to work. And this is precisely why it's first important to understand the what of the scientific observations so we can understand how we can apply them in our lives. The mystery of why we need two sets of rules to describe the world can be traced all the way back to an experiment that was first conducted in 1909 by British physicist Geoffrey Ingram Taylor. While the experiment is nearly a century old, its results are still the subject of controversy and uncertainty today. Since the time of the original experiment, it has been recreated, reconducted many, many times, and each time the results are identical, and each time they are just as mind-boggling. The experiment is called the double-slit experiment. It involves projecting quantum particles, the stuff the universe is made of, through the openings of a barrier that has two small holes in it and measuring the way they are detected after they come through those holes. Now, common sense suggests that when things begin on one side of the barrier as particles, that they would travel throughout the experiment as particles and end as particles as well. The evidence, however, shows that something quite different and quite extraordinary happens, somewhere between the place where the particles begin and the place where they end. Scientists have found that when an electron, for example, passes through the barrier with only one opening available, it does, in fact, act just the way we would expect an electron to act. It begins and ends its journey as a particle, and in doing so, there are no surprises. When two slits are used, however, the same electron does something that sounds impossible. Although it definitely begins its journey as a particle, something mysterious happens along the way. The electron passes through both slits at the same time, as only a wave of energy can do, and makes the kind of pattern on the target that only a wave of energy can make. And this is just one example of the kind of behavior that scientists simply have to call quantum weirdness. Because the only explanation here is that the second opening has somehow forced the electron to travel as if it were a wave, yet arrive at its destination just the way it began, as a particle. In other words, the photon is accommodating the conditions that it is given in the world. To do so, the electron has to somehow know that the second opening exists and has become available. And this is where the role of consciousness comes in, because it's assumed that the electron can't really know anything in the truest sense of the word. The only other source of that knowing is the person watching the experiment, the observer. The conclusion here is that somehow the knowledge that the electron has two possible paths to travel through is in the mind of that observer, and that the consciousness of the observer is what determines how the electron travels. The bottom line of the experiment is this: sometimes the electrons behave just the way we would expect, and when they do, the rules for our everyday world for things that are distinct and separate seem to apply. At other times, however, the electrons surprise us and they act like waves, and when they do that, they require the quantum rules to explain why that's happened, to explain their behavior. And this is where we have the opportunity to see our world and ourselves in a new light, because it means that we're part of everything, and that consciousness plays a key role in the universe. Reality Making 101. In the teachings of Mahayana Buddhism, it's believed that reality can only exist where our mind creates a focus. In fact, the teachings suggest that both the world of pure form and the world of the formless result from a form of consciousness that they call subjective imagination. While any experience certainly seems real enough to us, it's only where we focus our attention while we're having a feeling about the object of our focus that the possible reality becomes that real experience. Well, except for a slight variation in language, this ancient tradition sounds an awful lot like 20th century quantum theory. If all of the do's and the don'ts of quantum possibilities are true, and feeling is the key to choosing reality, then the question is, how do we feel as if something has happened, when the person next to us stares us squarely in the face and says that it hasn't? Are we lying to ourselves, for example, if we say that the loved one is already healed while we're standing next to them in the intensive care unit of St. Someone's Hospital? Well, the irony of this question is that its very nature eludes any one single answer. In a universe of many possibilities, there are many possible answers. Somewhere among all of those alternate realities, there exists a scenario where our loved one's healing has already happened. Somewhere, there exists a reality where the disease never occurred. But for reasons that we may never know or understand, however, this is not the scenario that's been awakened. It's not the reality that's lying on the gurney in front of us. So the answer to our question boils down to what we believe about the world and our power to choose. The question then becomes this: which possibility do we choose? Which reality does our loved one or the nurse or the doctor choose? And to answer, we must first acknowledge that we have the power to even make such a choice. Just as Neville's story of the man and his near-fatal illness demonstrated, the present reality is not sealed in stone. It appears to be soft and malleable. It can change, even when it looks as if there is no reason for it to change. In Neville's story, the young man's doctors had made a diagnosis. In other words, they chose a reality with an expected outcome. Not knowing that he had a choice, the man initially believed the doctors and bought into their version of that reality. But it was only when Neville offered him another possibility, and the man accepted that possibility, that his body responded to his new belief, and he healed. Einstein made a famous statement that we cannot solve a problem while we're in the same level of thinking that created it. Similarly, we cannot change a reality if we remain in the same consciousness that created that reality. To lock in one of the many possibilities described by quantum theories of reality, we must first pinpoint one. We must choose. And we do so through the way we observe it, that is, the way we feel about that possibility in our lives. Once we recognize that we have a choice in terms of what we see as our reality, the next question that's commonly asked is how? How do we do it? How are we to see our loved ones as healed if their body appears diseased? The answer to how begins with our willingness to look beyond the illusion of what the world is showing us, and this is where the workshop of life really begins. It's where we're invited to put all of our knowing and all of our spiritual theories to the test. With illness in our loved ones, for example, we're invited to see beyond the cancer that they may have experienced and think of them as already healed and what it's like to be with them in this new reality. But to choose a new reality, we must do more than just think about the new way of being or just wish that the healing in our loved ones has already happened. And this perhaps is the greatest caution in this way of seeing the world, and the one that can present the greatest pitfall as well. In our fear of losing the people, the places, the things that we hold most dear, there's a temptation, a very human temptation, to deal with the magnitude of the situation by denying the reality that stares us in the face and simply saying that we don't accept it. But unless we also take the actions that replace that frightening reality with one of healing, our non-acceptance is bound to produce little more than frustration and disappointment. I've personally experienced the loss of friends who did precisely this and are now no longer in this world today. Although they're the only ones who will ever know really what happened in their hearts and minds before they passed, I had the opportunity to witness some of the struggle that they went through with their beliefs. If I'm such a powerful being, they would ask, then why do I still have this condition? If I've changed my beliefs, why haven't I healed? Well, this topic is deep, it's personal, it's sensitive. And the answer can often bring up strong feelings and discussions about what is and how the universe seems to work and where God fits in. But the bottom line is this: there's a fine and delicate line between simply choosing a new outcome and actually following through with the thoughts and feelings and beliefs that fully awaken that outcome as a new reality. And that difference is summarized as our key number 8 in understanding the divine matrix. To simply say that we choose a new reality is not enough. To choose a quantum possibility, we must become that way of being. As Neville suggests, we must abandon ourselves to the new possibility, and in our love for that state, live in the new state and no more in the old state. And that's precisely what the ancient instructions found in some of our most cherished traditions invite us to do. In these traditions, the technique for this human to divine interface is often called prayer. Speaking quantum, feeling is the key. Previously, we identified interpretations of why quantum weirdness seems to happen the way it does. In general, the theories suggest that the act of us simply observing matter seems to change that matter. While each theory varied as to why the particular effect is happening, they all seem to suggest the same common denominator. That link is us, and our role as observers in the world. When we observe something, that is, when we consciously focus our attention in one place and time, it appears that we're locking one of the many quantum possibilities into place in that instant, and when we do so, that possibility becomes our reality because of us, because of our presence. While this appears to be revolutionary news to modern science, it's been accepted as the way things are in ancient traditions and indigenous cultures for centuries. In the words of times past, scribes, mystics, healers, and scholars did their very best to preserve this great secret of our relationship to the universe and to pass it on to us. Sometimes we find those traditions in the places we least expect to find such powerful wisdom. From the temple walls and tombs in the deserts of Egypt, for example, to the Gnostic wisdom of the ancient Nag Hammadi library and the traditional medicine practiced today throughout the North American desert Southwest. The language that breathes life into the possibilities of our imagination, dreams, and prayers remains with us today. Perhaps the clearest example of this language is best described through the words of a man that lived in a monastery nearly 15,000 feet above sea level, high on the Tibetan plateau. In the spring of 1998, I had the opportunity of facilitating a combined research trip and pilgrimage into the highlands of central Tibet for 22 days. During that time with our group, we found ourselves immersed in some of the most magnificent, rugged, pristine, remote land remaining on the earth today. Along the way, we visited 12 monasteries, 2 nunneries, and some of the most beautiful humans you could ever imagine, including monks, nuns, nomads, pilgrims. It was during that time that I found myself face to face with the abbot of one of the monasteries and had the opportunity to ask the question that we'd traveled so far and for so long to ask. On an icy, high-altitude morning, our group found itself cramped into a tiny chapel surrounded by Buddhist altars and ancient thangkas. I focused my attention directly into the eyes of the timeless-looking man seated lotus-style in front of me. Through our translator, I'd just asked him the same question that I'd asked every monk and nun that we'd met throughout our pilgrimage. "When we see your prayers," I began, "what are you doing? When we see you tone and chant for 14 and 16 hours a day, when we see the bells, the bowls, the gongs, the chimes, the mudras, and the mantras on the outside, what's happening to you on the inside?" I wanted to know. A powerful sensation rippled through my body as the translator shared the abbot's answer. The abbot simply said, "You've never seen our prayers, because a prayer cannot be seen." As he adjusted the heavy wool robes beneath his feet, the abbot continued. He said, "What you have seen is what we do to create the feeling in our bodies. The feeling is the prayer." How beautiful, I thought to myself, and how simple. Just as the late 20th century experiments had shown, it's human feeling and emotion that affects the stuff our world is made of, our inner language that changes the atoms, electrons, and photons of our outer world. It's less about the actual words that we speak, however, and more about the feeling that the words create within us, the feeling underlying the words. It's the language of feeling that speaks to the quantum forces of the universe. Feeling is the language the divine matrix recognizes, and key number 9 helps us to remember this. Key number 9 states, feeling is the language that speaks to the divine matrix. So to speak to the field in a meaningful way, feel as though your goal is already accomplished, as though your prayer is already answered. Now the abbot was telling us the same thing as the great scientists of the 20th century. Not only was he sharing the same ideas that the scientists had documented, but he was taking us one step further. The abbot was sharing the instructions that describe how we can speak the language of quantum possibilities, and he was doing it through a technique that we know today as a form of prayer. No wonder prayers work miracles. They put us in touch with the pure space where all things begin, where the miracles of our minds become the reality of our world. Compassion, a force of nature and a human experience. The clarity of the abbot's answer sent me reeling. His words echoed the ideas that had been recorded in ancient Gnostic and Christian traditions over 2,000 years ago. For our prayers to be answered, we must transcend the doubt that often accompanies the positive nature of our desire. Following a brief teaching on the power of overcoming those polarities, the words of Jesus recorded in the Nag Hammadi library remind us of the same thing. They remind us of the power of our commands. In words that should be familiar to all of us by now, we're reminded that when we do this and say to the mountain, move, the mountain will move away. Through the clarity of the abbot's words, he answered the mystery of what it is that the monks and nuns were doing in their prayers. They were speaking the quantum language of feeling and emotion, a language that has no words and no outward expression. Well, in 2005, I had the opportunity to revisit the monasteries of Tibet for a total of 37 days. During the journey, our group learned that the abbot who had originally shared the secret of feeling in 1998 had died. Through circumstances that were never made quite clear to us, we simply knew he was no longer in this world, even though we'd never met the man that took his place. When that man heard of our return, he welcomed us back into his monastery, and he allowed another opportunity to continue the conversation that began in 1998. On a frosty Tibetan morning in a different chapel, we found ourselves face to face with the new abbot of the monastery. Only minutes before, we'd been led through the meandering stone-lined passageway that made it possible for us to be in this tiny, cold, and dimly lit room. In absolute darkness, we'd carefully felt our way one step at a time along the slippery floor, now dangerously smooth from centuries of spilled yak butter packed onto the surface. It was here, in the cool, thin air of the ancient room nestled in the heart of this monastery, that I asked the new abbot my follow-up question. My question was this: what connects us with one another and our world and the universe? What is the stuff that carries our prayers beyond our bodies and holds this world together? That was my question. He looked directly at me as our translator echoed my question in Tibetan. And just as suddenly as he'd become silent, the abbot spoke, answering my question with a single word. Instinctively, I glanced to the guide who was our go-between for the entire conversation. I was not prepared for the translation I heard coming back to me. The one-word answer was simply compassion. Compassion. The Geshe, the great teacher, says that compassion is what connects us. Well, how can this be? I asked. I looked for clarity in what I was hearing. Is the abbot describing compassion as a force of nature or as an emotional experience that we have inside of our bodies? Well, suddenly an animated dialogue broke out as the translator returned my question to the abbot. Compassion is what connects all things. That was his final answer. Compassion, and that was it. Following nearly 10 minutes of a bantering dialogue involving the deepest elements of Tibetan Buddhism, all that I got to hear were those words. A few days later, I found myself engaged in the same conversation, yet once again, and asking the same question of a high-ranking monk in another monastery. Rather than the formality of being in the presence of an abbot, however, we were in the monk's cell, tiny room where he ate, slept, where he prayed and studied when he was not in the great chanting hall. Well, by now, our translator is becoming familiar with the form of my questions and what I was trying to understand. And as we all huddled together around the yak butter lamps in the tiny room, I looked up at the low ceiling. It was covered with black soot from countless years of the same lamps burning for heat and light in the very place where we found ourselves in that afternoon. And just as I'd asked the abbot only days before, through the translator, I posed the same question to the monk. I asked, is compassion a force of creation that holds the universe together, or is it an experience that we create in our bodies? The young monk rolled his eyes to the place on the ceiling where I'd been looking only seconds before. He took a deep sigh, and he thought for a moment, collecting the wisdom of what he'd learned in those monasteries since he entered at the age of 8. Suddenly he lowered his eyes and looked at me as he responded. The answer was short, it was powerful, and it made tremendous sense. The young monk simply said, "It's both." Those are the words that came back to me from his mouth. Compassion is both a force in the universe and a human experience that we may create in our bodies. Well, on that day, in a monk's monastery cell halfway around the world, at nearly 15,000 feet above sea levels and hours from even the nearest town, I heard the words of a wisdom that's so simple, yet so powerful, that many Western traditions have overlooked them to this very day. The monk had just shared the secret of what connects us to everything in the universe, as well as the quality that makes our feelings and emotions so powerful. They're one and the same. Not just any feeling will do. Recent translations of ancient prayers recorded in Aramaic, the language of the Essenes and the Dead Sea Scrolls, seem to support precisely what the monk was sharing as the secrets of reality and healing. They also offer fresh clues as to why such instructions often appear to be so vague. By retranslating the original New Testament documents, for example, it's clear that tremendous liberties were taken over the centuries with the ancient authors' words and intent. As the saying goes, a lot was lost in the translation. With regard to our ability to participate in the events of life, health, and family, a comparison of the modern biblical version of Ask and You Will Receive, for example, with its original text gives us an idea of just how much can be lost. The modern and condensed version of the King James Bible reads, quote, "Whatsoever ye ask the Father in my name, he will give it to you. Hitherto have ye asked nothing in my name. Ask and ye shall receive, that your joy may be full." When we compare this, however, to the original text, we see the key that's missing. In the following paragraph, I've emphasized the missing part. It simply states that all things that you ask straightly, directly, from inside my name, you'll be given. So far, you've not done this. And here's the part that was edited. Ask without hidden motive, and be surrounded by your answer. Be enveloped by what you desire, that your gladness be full. Well, in these words, we're reminded of the quantum principle that tells us that feeling is a language to direct and focus our consciousness. It's a state of being that we're in rather than something that we do at a certain time of day. So while it's clear that feeling is the language that the divine matrix recognizes, it's also clear that not just any feeling will do. Because if it were, then the world would be a very confusing place, with one person's idea of what should be overlapping another's very different idea. But the monk had stated that compassion is both a force of creation and the experience that accesses the force. In the deepest elements of the teaching, to achieve compassion, we must approach a situation without our strong expectation of the rightness or the wrongness of the situation's outcome. In other words, we must approach it without our judgment or our ego. And this appears to be precisely the quality of the emotion that is so key when we speak to the divine matrix in a way that's meaningful and effective. As the physicist Amit Goswami suggests, it takes more than an ordinary state of consciousness to make a quantum possibility a present reality. In fact, to do so, he suggests that we must be in what he describes as a non-ordinary state of consciousness. To create this non-ordinary state of consciousness, The Aramaic translation states that we must ask without hidden motive. Another way of clarifying this very important part of the instruction in modern terms is to say that we must make our choices from a desire that is not based in our ego. The great secret to bringing the focus of our imagination, beliefs, and healing and peace into present reality is that we must do so without a strong attachment. So in other words, we're invited to pray without our judgments of what should or should not be happening. Key number 10 reminds us of this. It states that not just any feeling will do. The feelings that create must be without ego and without judgment. Perhaps one of the best descriptions of how we experience this neutral place with no judgment is found in the work of the great Sufi poet Rumi. Through words that are simple and powerful, he states, out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right-doing, there's a field. He says, I will meet you there. How often can we truly say that we're in Rumi's field of non-judgment at any time in our lives, and especially when the fate of our loved ones is hanging in the balance? Yet this appears to be precisely the greatest lesson of our power, the greatest challenge of our lives, and the great irony of our ability to create in a participatory universe. It seems that the stronger our desire is to change our world, the more elusive our power to do so becomes. This is because our desire is so often ego-based. If it weren't, the change would not hold such significance for us. But as we mature into the state of consciousness where we know that we can change our world, it also seems like it becomes less important for us to do so. Similar to the way our desire to drive a car, for example, seems to wane after we've started driving. In having the ability to work miracles of healing and peace, the urgency to make them happen seems to disappear. This may be because, along with knowing that we can change our world, comes an acceptance of the world just the way it is. It's this freedom of having power without attaching so much importance to it that allows us to be even more effective in our prayers, and herein may lie the answer to the question asked by those who meditated, chanted, ommed, danced, and prayed for their recovery of their loved ones. Although every act was without question well-intentioned, they often involve a strong attachment to having or making the healing of their loved ones happen. And that attachment was a belief that a miraculous healing was necessary. And if the healing still needed to happen, the implication was that it had not happened yet. If it had, we wouldn't be asking for it in our prayers. It's as if by wanting the outcome of healing, the efforts to create it actually reinforced the reality that the disease was present. And this leads to the second part of the ancient instruction, the one that's often overlooked in our efforts to bring miracles into our lives. The next part of the translation invites us to be surrounded by our answer. Be surrounded by our answer. Be enveloped by what we desire, so our joy may come to pass. This passage reminds us in words of precisely what the experiments and the ancient traditions suggest in the shared wisdom of their time. We must first have the feeling of our healing, our abundance, our peace, and our prayers of well-being answered in our hearts as if they've already happened before they can ever become the reality of our lives. In the previous passages from the Nag Hammadi library, Jesus suggests that those he's speaking with haven't done that. Just like my friends with the powerful medicine of prayer and good intentions, while they may believe that they asked for their prayers to be answered, if they're asking with simply the words, please let this healing happen, then Jesus says that this isn't the language that the universal field of the divine matrix recognizes. He reminds his disciples they must speak to the universe in a way that's meaningful. When we feel as though we're surrounded by healing in our loved ones and enveloped by peace in our world, that feeling is both the language as well as the code that opens the door to all possibilities. In this feeling, we move from the viewpoint that suspects we are simply experiencing whatever comes our way to the perspective that knows we're part of all that is, and in doing so, we create a shift of energy that may be described as the classic quantum leap. In much the same way that an atom's electron jumps from one energy level to another without moving through the space between, when we really know that we're speaking the quantum language of choice and not simply thinking what may or may not be, we are in another state of consciousness. It's this state that becomes the pure space where dreams, prayers, and even miracles begin. When the miracle stops working, the effects of the mind-body connection and certain kinds of prayer are well documented in the open literature. From studies in major universities to field tests in war-torn countries, it's clear that the way we feel within our bodies affects not only us, but the world beyond our bodies. This relationship between our inner and our outer experiences appears to be the reason that some forms of prayer empower us as they do. And while the precise mechanism as to why prayers work may not be fully understood, they do work and the evidence is documented. So in addition to the positive effects of prayer, however, there's also a lingering mystery. In the studies, the effects of the prayers seem to last only for the period of time that the people are praying. When the prayer stops, the positive effects seem to end as well. During experiments in prayers of peace, for example, the studies clearly showed that there were statistically significant declines in key indicators that the researchers were observing. Traffic accidents, for example, declined during the prayers. Emergency hospital room visits declined in the cities where the prayers were occurring. Even violent crimes against people declined. In the presence of peace, it seems that all that could happen was peace. As interesting as these results are, however, what they show next has been an ongoing mystery to those studying the results. When the experiment stopped, the violence returned, in some instances reaching levels even greater than before the experiments began. What happened? Why did the effects of the meditations and the prayers appear to stop? Well, the answer to these questions may be the key to understanding the power of our lost modality of prayer. What happened was the trainees stopped what they were doing. They stopped their meditations. They stopped their prayers. And this is the answer to our mystery. If we believe that choosing our reality is something that we only do for the moment, then it makes perfect sense that when we stop feeling as if our new reality exists, the effect of our choice stops as well. Our reality making may be a short-lived choice if we assume that feelings of peace and abundance and healing are experiences that only last for minutes at a time. Between the modern experiments and the instructions in ancient texts, we know that reality making is more than what we do. It is what we are. To remind us of this simple and powerful realization, key number 11 states that the secret to lasting effects in our prayers is to maintain the feeling as if the outcome has already happened. In this way, we perpetuate the blueprint of peace and healing in the divine matrix. If feeling and emotion are the way we choose, and we're feeling all of the time, then that means we're choosing all of the time. We can feel our gratitude for the peace in our world because there's always peace somewhere. We can feel the appreciation for the healing in our loved ones as well as ourselves because we're always healed and renewed to some degree every day. This may be precisely what the Aramaic versions of the Gospels were trying to convey to us, the people of their future, through the language that they left nearly 2,000 years ago. And it may be precisely this effect that's described in the Gnostic text of the Lost Gospel of Thomas as well. That text says that if you bring forth that which you have within you, it will save you. If you do not, it will destroy you. Though the admonition is brief, the implication is powerful. Through the words that were attributed to the Master Jesus, we're reminded that the power to shape our lives and our world is something that lives inside of us, and it's a power that we all share. Life doesn't always follow the rules of physics. What happens if we live in a way that breaks the supposed rules of physics? What happens if we don't even know those rules exist? Is it possible that we can follow the example of quantum particles and do things like being in two places at once? Common sense tells us that if something exists in one place, then it certainly can't be somewhere else at the same time, regardless of what it is. Yet, that is precisely what the experiments have shown. The obvious question that follows such discoveries is that if the stuff that the world is made of can be in two places at once, and we are part of that world, then why can't we do the same thing? Why can't we fulfill our duty in the workplace or the classroom and at the same time be enjoying ourselves on a sunny beach or hiking through a mountain canyon somewhere? While we've all wondered from time to time if such a thing can happen, the possibility is really a pure fantasy, isn't it? When we hear of something unusual happening on many occasions involving different people, there's usually some underlying truth to those reports. While the specifics may vary, it's often possible to trace the underlying theme to an actual event in time. The Great Flood is a perfect example of what I mean here. Throughout history and cultures, there's an almost universal theme that's recounted time and time again. Playing out on different continents through different languages and involving different people, the story and the outcome are nearly identical. Though the specifics vary, in a similar way, history is punctuated with reports of people who have bilocated. That is, they physically appeared to other people in different locations at the same instant in time. Often these feats are attributed to yogis or mystics or those who have in some way mastered a hidden, dormant ability. Not always, however. The common thread that seems to link these reports is that those who do the bilocating are generally masters of the power of human emotions, such as love and compassion. Often the reports are associated with the holy works of saints and are well documented by the missionaries and native peoples and those believed to be reliable witnesses to the miracles. Among the best documented of the many instances of bilocation attributed to St. Francis of Paola, for example, was a case that appeared in 1507. As the holy man was fulfilling his duties at the church altar, people who had come to see him found that he looked like he was in a deep state of prayer, and they decided not to disturb him. When they left the church, however, they were more than surprised to find him outside the church where they had just been, and he was not simply standing there alone. He was talking with the locals and those passing by on the street. Quickly, they ran back into the chapel, only to find that he had never left and was still there, lost in prayer. Somehow, through a mysterious state of consciousness associated with a deep meditative state, St. Francis of Paola had appeared to the same people in two locations during the same period of time. Between 1620 and 1631, Sister Mary of Agreda reported more than 500 journeys across the ocean of her home and away to a distant land. She was a nun who lived for 46 years in a convent in Agreda, Spain. To those who knew her and lived with her, she never once left the convent. For Mary, however, she would describe flying to the distant lands that she spoke of during what she called her experiences of ecstasy. Such an experience today could be chalked up to a 300-year-old report of remote viewing. That is, the ability to witness and perceive events from a distance by directing consciousness to a precise location, except for one curious distinction. Mary not only visited the lands that she described, but she taught the natives that she encountered there about the life of Jesus. And though she only spoke her native Spanish, the Indians could understand her as she shared with them the teachings of the great master. The documentation of her sightings came when the Archbishop of Mexico heard of the sightings in a faraway land. When he sent missionaries to investigate, they were amazed to find the Indians of the area were already well educated in the life of Jesus. So well, in fact, that they were immediately baptized on the spot. Nearly a decade later, Mary's mystical journeys were finally validated. While she was under a church-ordered oath of obedience, she described the intimate details of a land that she had never visited physically. Her description was so complete that she included the subtleties of climate and changing seasons, nuances of culture, and even the beliefs of the people that she had taught. Following what the church called a rigorous ecclesiastical examination, Mary of Agreda's mystical journeys were declared by the church to be authentic, and she was given the rare consideration of what is called the highest rank among the mystics of the ages. Well, not all reports of bilocation are from the murky years of the 16th and 17th centuries. As recently as World War II, there were many instances of holy men appearing in multiple locations at once. One of the best documented is that of Italy's mystical Padre Pio. Following his promise that the Nazi-occupied city of San Giovanni Rotondo would be spared from the destruction of the Allies, he appeared in broad daylight in a way that is rare even for bilocation. As the bombers arrived over the city to target German strongholds, the image of Padre Pio in brown robes appeared in front of their planes, hovering in midair. Unlike brief apparitions that are sometimes reported under the stress of battlefield conditions, however, this image lingered for all to see. And as long as it remained, any attempt to release the bombs on the city failed. Frustrated and mystified, the pilots changed course and landed their planes at a nearby airfield with all of the bombs that were with them when they began their mission. Shortly after, one of the pilots went to a nearby chapel, and to his amazement, inside of the chapel, he found the same friar that he'd seen earlier hovering in front of his plane. It was Padre Pio. The Padre was not a ghost or the apparition of a long-deceased saint, as the pilot had suspected. He was real, he was alive. And on that day, he had somehow been in two places at the same time, on the ground in the chapel and in the air directly in front of the planes. While the Allies liberated Italy, just as the Padre had promised, the city of San Giovanni Rotondo was spared. When we experience something that appears to happen beyond the realm of what we know to be true, we often chalk it up to a miracle. So what are we to make of lingering reports and documented cases of bilocation and other seemingly miraculous feats that span over 600 years? Can we write them off as pure fantasy or wishful thinking? Possibly. There's always a chance that they were conjured up by people with too much time in their hands or those who honestly wanted them to be true. However, what if there's something more happening here? If it is proven to us beyond doubt that we are not limited by the laws of physics, at least the way we understand those laws today, that proof allows us to see ourselves in a powerful new light. It does so by offering us something beyond faith upon which to base our new beliefs. The key is this: to do what seems to be impossible, one person has to push the limits of what we previously believed to be true and do it first. To live miracles in our lives, we must first overcome our beliefs that the miracle is not possible. To help us do so, key number 12 reminds us that beyond any reasonable doubt, the new studies do show that we are not bound by the laws of physics, at least the way we know those laws today. To help us overcome our personal limitations of doubt and conditioning, it often helps for us to see someone else perform a miracle first, so we can see that it's possible. Maybe that person is particularly gifted in one area of life, such as having a healing ability, for example. Or maybe that person simply has the openness to see the world differently, regardless of how it happens. Whether it's Jesus or your next-door neighbor, once a person does that special something, then the same miracle becomes available for everyone else. If we understand how the stuff that we're made of behaves under the conditions of a miracle, maybe we can find those conditions in our own lives. And to understand how it works, we'll need to explore the single facet of our existence that gives each of us the power to change our world by changing ourselves, the power of the hologram. Chapter 4, Once Connected, Always Connected, Living in a Holographic Universe. A mystery was alluded to in the previous experiments where the photons were separated by 14 miles, yet acted as if they were still connected, a mystery that was never solved. Part of the proof that the divine matrix actually exists comes from experiments precisely like this one. They show that when two somethings have been physically joined, like those two particles, for example, they act as if they're still connected to one another, even though they were separated by distances ranging from feet to hundreds of miles. The question is why? We've all heard that a picture is worth 1,000 words. As a visual person, I know this is true for me. To see one demonstration of how to start the engine of my truck, for example, is much more meaningful to me than reading all the pages of a manual describing why the pistons move and why the spark plugs spark when I turn the key. Once I can see the big picture, then I can always go back and understand the details if they're even still important. Sometimes I just want my truck to start. And I suspect many of us work this way. Although we find ourselves in a high-tech world of how-to manuals and computer tutorials of why something is as it is, a direct experience is still the best way to explain a new idea clearly. A powerful example of such a direct experience is our introduction to this idea of a hologram. Holograms have been used in research since their discovery in the late 1940s. Since that time, however, precisely what one is and how it works has had little meaning to the average non-technical person until the original Star Wars motion picture was released in 1977. In a pivotal scene early in the film, we see the representative of an entire planet, Princess Leia, pleading for help to save her people. She encodes her requested message in the form of a digital hologram stored in the memory of R2-D2, her android, a character that's captured the hearts and the imaginations of audiences throughout the world. While Princess Leia remains in one part of the universe in the movie, R2-D2 carries her holographic image to another world in a place far, far away. The message remains secret until Luke Skywalker, the young warrior, coaxes it from him. And in a stunning display of what, for that time, was state-of-the-art motion picture graphics, R2-D2 delivered Princess Leia's message by projecting a miniature image of her into the room as if she were there in person, a hologram. Suddenly, her lifelike image appeared in mid-air to make the plea. Because she looked three-dimensional to the movie audience, we were given the feeling that if we were there next to her, we could reach out and touch her, just like we could touch a person sitting next to us in the theater. If we did, however, our hands would pass through empty air because she's just a hologram. For many people in the 70s, this scene was their first experience of a holographic projection and how real one can appear. It also gave us a surprising glimpse of what our telephone calls may look like someday in a not-too-distant future. Even today, over 20 years later, the mere mention of the word hologram still brings to mind the image of Princess Leia. For all intents and purposes, a hologram is generally thought of as a picture, a three-dimensional image that looks lifelike when it's projected in a certain way or seen in a certain kind of light. And while this film rendition is one example of what a hologram may produce, there's much more to a hologram than simply a photograph. The holographic principle may be one of the simplest, yet least understood phenomena of nature, and at the same time, this principle could hold the greatest possibility for making change on the largest possible scales within a time frame that's dizzying to the mind. To apply this power in our personal lives, however, we must understand precisely what a hologram is and how it works. So, first things first, just what is a hologram? If you were to ask scientists to explain a hologram, they would probably begin by describing it as a special kind of photograph, where the image on a surface suddenly appears three-dimensional when it's exposed to direct light. The process that creates these images involves a way of using laser light so that the picture becomes distributed over the entire surface of the film, a property that's called distributedness. It's this property that makes the holographic film so unique. Through distributedness, every part of the surface contains the entire image, just as it was originally seen, only on a smaller scale. In other words, every part of the surface is a hologram. If the original image were divided into any number of pieces, each one, no matter how small, would still show a full view of the entire original image. Just as the direct experience of starting a car's engine is the most effective way to show how it works, probably the best way to illustrate how a hologram works is through an example. In the late 1980s, a series of bookmarks appeared on the market using holographic technology. These are collector's items by now. Each one was made of a shiny strip of silver paper that looked like glossy aluminum foil at first glance. When the paper was held directly under a bright light, however, and tilted back and forth, something happened that set these bookmarks apart from traditional ones. Suddenly, the images in the foil looked like they'd come to life and were hovering in the air just above the paper itself. As the bookmark was tilted one way and then another, the image remained present, three-dimensional and lifelike. I remember a number of different versions of these bookmarks, the face of Jesus, for example, or the body of Mother Mary, a dolphin jumping over a pyramid, and a rosebud in full bloom. If you have one of these bookmarks, you can do an experiment to prove to yourself just how a hologram works. A word of caution is necessary here. The drawback to this experiment is that your bookmark will be destroyed in the process. But with this in mind, you can use a sharp pair of scissors and cut your beautiful shiny bookmark into hundreds of pieces of any shape. And then you can take the smallest of those fragments and cut it again into an even smaller piece. If the bookmark is truly a hologram, you'll be able to look at your tiny speck of a bookmark under a magnifying glass and you will still see the entire image, only on a smaller scale. The reason is because the image exists everywhere throughout the bookmark. This is an example of why the holographic principle is so powerful in our lives. Key number 13 reminds us that in a holographic something, every piece of that something mirrors the whole something. Solving the mystery of the twin photons. So, with a clearer understanding of what a hologram is and how it's created, let's revisit the University of Geneva experiment from Chapter 1. To recap, a distance of 14 miles separated two particles, twin photons. When one photon was forced to choose between two pathways at the end of its journey, the second photon always made exactly the same choice as if it somehow knew what its twin was doing. The same experiment has been repeated on a number of different occasions, and each time the results are identical. The two particles act as if they're still connected, even though they're separated by miles. Conventional wisdom suggests that for this kind of connection to happen, the photons are somehow sending signals to one another, and this is where a problem comes in for physicists. Because for a signal to travel between these particles, it would have to be moving so fast, faster than the speed of light. But according to Einstein's theory of relativity, nothing can travel this fast. So, is it possible that these particles are violating the laws of physics, or are they showing us something else? Could they be showing us something so foreign to the way we think about our world that we're still trying to force the mystery of what we see into the familiar comfort of the way we believe energy gets from one place to another? What if the signal from one photon never traveled to get to the second? Is it possible that we live in a universe where the information between photons, or the prayer for our loved ones, or the desire for peace in a place halfway around the world never needs to travel anywhere to be received? Well, the answer is yes. This appears to be precisely the kind of universe we live in. Dr. Russell Targ, the co-founder of the Cognitive Sciences program at the Stanford Research Institute in Menlo Park, California, describes this connection eloquently and beautifully. We live in a non-local world, he says, where things physically separated from one another can, nonetheless, be an instantaneous communication. Targ clarifies what such a connection means, stating, "It's not that I close my eyes and send a message to a person 1,000 miles away, but rather in some sense there is no separation between my consciousness and his consciousness." The reason that the signals did not have to travel between the photons is because they were already there. They never left from anywhere and were never carried to anywhere in the conventional sense. By definition, every place in a hologram is a reflection of every other place, and every property that exists anywhere in the hologram also exists everywhere else. So, in the non-local hologram of our universe, the underlying energy that links everything instantly connects everything as well. Spiritual teachers generally agree with scientists on this view of reality. As Ervin Laszlo, the founder of systems philosophy, describes, life evolves, as does the universe itself, in a sacred dance with an underlying field. This seems to be precisely what the ancient Avatta Sakka Sutra of Mahayana Buddhism is describing as the wonderful net of energy that connects all things in the universe. If the universe is non-local and holographic, not only does this net link everything together, every point within the net also reflects all other points. In addition to being the universe, the net contains the universe and gives it holographic qualities. Throughout the net, the ancient sutra describes an infinite number of what it calls the eyes in the universe. And as there are an infinite number of these eyes, all things are visible to all other things. In what may be the oldest description of a hologram discovered so far, the sutra then reveals the power of each jewel to create change throughout the entire net. It actually states that each of the jewels reflected in any one is also reflecting all of the others, so that there is an infinite reflecting process occurring. Well, according to the translation of the sutra I've just referenced, this net symbolizes a cosmos in which there's an infinitely repeated relationship among all members of the cosmos. What a beautiful description of the subtle yet powerful principle that nature uses to survive and grow and evolve. In a holographic world where each piece already has the whole mirrored only on a smaller scale, everything is already everywhere. From the simplicity of a single blade of grass to the complexity of our bodies, it's this holographic principle that promises everything we need to survive and grow is always with us, everywhere, all of the time. So as we understand the power of our infinitely connected hologram of consciousness, it becomes clear that nothing is hidden and there are no secret places. These things are the byproducts of our sense of separateness. While it may look like that we're separated from one another and the rest of the world, that separation does not exist on the level where the hologram originates, within the divine matrix. With this level of unity, there really can be no such things as here and there. And this is why any change that we wish to see in our world, from the healing and safety of our loved ones to peace in the Middle East, or any of the 60-plus nations of our world now engaged in armed conflict, does not need to be sent from inside of our hearts and minds to the places where it's needed. You do not need to send anything anywhere. Our prayers are inside of us, and they're already everywhere. This is the powerful realization that's the 14th key in our exploration of the divine matrix. That key states that the universally connected hologram of consciousness promises that the instant you create your good wishes and prayers, they're already at their destination and they're already received. The implications of this principle are vast and deep. To really know what it means in our lives, however, we need to examine the last piece of how our hologram works, the power to create change within the hologram. If everything is really connected, and if everything is already everywhere all of the time, then what happens when we change something in one part of the hologram? And once again, the answer might surprise you. A change anywhere means a change everywhere. Just as a hologram contains the original image in all of its many parts, any change made to just one of those parts becomes a change that's reflected everywhere throughout the pattern. What a powerful relationship. A single change in one place can make a difference everywhere. Perhaps the best example of how little changes can affect an entire system can be seen in something that we're all familiar with, the DNA of our bodies. It's estimated that average humans have between 50 and 100 trillion cells in their bodies. Each of those cells contains 23 pairs of chromosomes that contain someone's DNA, their life code. When we do the math, this means that average people carry somewhere between 2,300 trillion and 4,600 trillion copies of DNA in their bodies. So just imagine how long it would take to make a change in someone's DNA if we attempted to update each copy of that DNA one cell at a time. But when DNA makes a change in the blueprint of a species, it doesn't have to do so one strand at a time. Because of the holographic principle, when a species' DNA changes, that change is reflected throughout the whole almost immediately. And this is the principle that empowers us, each of us, to create big change in our world through the seemingly little moments in our everyday lives. Key number 15 reminds us that through the hologram of consciousness, a little change in our lives is mirrored everywhere in our world. You're probably asking yourself, why is this important in my life? Well, while this is an obvious question, the answer may be even less obvious. The subtle power of the hologram is that it offers us the leverage to make a tremendous change on a large scale by changing a pattern in only one place. Understanding the holographic principle is important because it appears to describe precisely the way we work. From the DNA of our bodies to the atomic structure of the world around us, to the way that memory and consciousness work, we appear to be holograms of a greater existence that we're only beginning to understand. The power of a mustard seed. The pioneering work of Carl Pribram and the studies of other researchers that have followed showed that our minds and our brains function as holographic information processors. And if this is true for us as individuals, then it makes sense that our collective mind and our collective consciousness may work the same way as well. Today, over 6 billion humans and 6 billion minds inhabit the earth. Within the container of the divine matrix, each individual's mind is part of a larger whole. Regardless of how different they may appear from one another, within each mind is the pattern of the whole consciousness. And through that link, we each have direct access to the entire pattern. In other words, we each have the power to change the hologram of our world. While for some people this is an unconventional way to think about who we are, for others, it's perfectly aligned with their beliefs and their experiences. Scientific studies support these principles and have found that when people within a group share a common experience of consciousness, the effects of that experience can be detected beyond the group itself and even beyond the building that they're meeting in. Clearly, inner experiences are being carried through some subtle conduit in a way that's not limited by the laws of physics, at least the way we know those laws today. One example of this phenomenon is seen in the effect that transcendental meditation, or TM, can have upon large populations. 1972, for example, 24 cities in the United States, each with populations over 10,000 people, experienced meaningful changes in their communities when as few as 1% of those people participated in the studies. That's only 100 people. Those involved in the studies used specific techniques of meditation to create inner experiences of peace that were mirrored in the world around them. Those involved in the studies used specific techniques of meditation to create the inner experiences of peace that were mirrored in the world around them. The effect is called the Maharishi effect, in honor of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who stated that when 1% of a given population practiced the techniques of meditation that he offered, there would be a reduction in violence and crime for that population. These and similar studies led to a landmark project. It was called the International Peace Project in the Middle East and was published in the Journal of Conflict Resolution in 1988. During the Israeli-Lebanese War of the early 1980s, practitioners were trained in precise techniques of TM to create peace in their bodies, rather than simply to think about peace in their minds or pray for peace to occur. On specific days of the month, specific times of each day, these people were positioned within the war-torn areas of the Middle East. During the window of time that they were at peace, terrorist activities stopped altogether, crimes against people declined, emergency hospital room visits declined, and traffic accidents dropped. When the people stopped their practice, all of these statistics reversed. Well, these studies confirm the earlier findings that when a small percentage of the population achieve peace within themselves, that peace is reflected in the world around them. The findings took into account the days of the week, holidays, and even lunar cycles, and were so consistent that the researchers were able to identify the minimum number of people needed to experience peace within before that peace is mirrored in the world around them. The number is the square root of 1% of the population, and this number represents only the minimum number required for the effect to begin. The more people that participate, the more pronounced the effect. So while we may not fully understand all the reasons as to why the effects are present, the correlations and the results demonstrate that they are. To apply this principle in our lives for any group of people, regardless of whether it's a small community, the congregation of a church, a large city, or the entire planet, to determine how many people are needed to work together for peace and healing in that community,